Thank you, Linda. Of course, we're terrified to be here in this august group. You'll see it's kind of a tag team operation. I'll also say that as I thought about this, Billie I went into very deep territory, which was to give a small history lesson and said, Billie, let me know that I know nothing about history. I borrowed the first slides from David Leatherbarrow, who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania, to help to give a little bit of context to our talk.
Well, I told him that our knowledge of this history is very shallow, and this is a very deep pool full of very good swimmers, so he better watch out. So we're going to try to condense that part, because I told him he wasn't allowed to go too deeply into the history part. We're going to slide through and get to the architecture part, which at least is something that we know about and we can tell you about.
No, actually, yeah, we do know about our work. That's what we call it. Useful knowledge is about all we have. We're part of the leather apron group, as I recall. I did want to start on the Parkway, and you may know something about the history of the Parkway, but since our project's on the Parkway, I really felt this was important. Statue of George Washington looking down the Parkway at the City Hall, the largest masonry building in America, and the top of which has a sculpture of William Penn, designed by Alexander Calder's grandfather. Interesting. The image on the left is really, because we just had a small history lesson, is Philadelphia in this particular area in the 1840s. And interestingly, we found out this is the time just preceding the Civil War. A huge amount of industry has occurred. Actually, the cities are a slum. There are people making great amounts of money and on the backs of laborers, and the city is chaos on the left. And a city beautiful movement occurred really in the world, and we could see it in Barcelona, and you can see it in Paris, you could see it elsewhere in America, even with the Olmsted brothers. And they decided to create a boulevard that would actually create order from chaos, and of course, in some ways empower the even more wealthy who would be further out in the suburbs, but in a way create a park for the citizens of Philadelphia. And so we have the Parkway, and a very early sketch of it actually started in about 1857. These are the people, and actually we just learned something. This is the model that they hoped the Parkway would be. We're looking from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, looking towards City Hall, and we just heard earlier that APS was going to move onto the Parkway. Well, one of those buildings might have been a vision for the APS. Thank goodness they didn't move. It actually looks like too many buildings. Very, very interesting aspect of Philadelphia was actually the creation of the waterworks, and that's another story, actually started by Latrobe in 1799 to help to give clean water to the citizens of Philadelphia. A dam that actually blocks the Schuylkill River, which is tidal up to a certain point, was going to keep fresh water further north. That's the dam actually built in the 1700s, and the waterworks, which was completed in 1819 or something like that. But that then put fresh water to the citizens of Philadelphia and was part of the idea of creating a more healthy city. The plans then, these I think were plans obviously early 20th century, and there was a reservoir down where the Philadelphia Museum of Art is. That was a rock outcropping. The rock outcropping is still there. In fact, that's a physical feature of Fairmount Park. And there is topography, there's real topography in Philadelphia. And this 1 mile long boulevard that extends out there, reminiscent a little bit of the work in Paris, was in fact conceptualized by Parisian architects who came to America.
So this is Logan Fountain, and it is in David Leatherbarrow's writing a kind of remnant or a sort of reminder of what is in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. And so if you look at the lower image, that's Paris, and this is Philadelphia above. On one side is the Free Library of Philadelphia, and on the other side is the former family courthouse. And the resemblance between the buildings is actually quite amazing.
So interestingly, not only was Benjamin Franklin looking toward Paris in to look for a culture that would actually elevate Americans, and the APSers were looking for foreign members. In fact, this was really exciting that, in fact, we were so closely, our idea of culture really was defined by Europe. Right next to the Barnes Foundation is a statue by Rodin. The Paul Cray, who was one of the designers of the Parkway in 1920s, and actually his first sketches were in 1907, was the head of the School of Architecture at Penn, and actually was taught Lou Kahn, one of Philadelphia's greatest architects and one of America's greatest architects. And he designed the Rodin Museum, which is exactly next to the Barnes.
So those of you who have gone up the Franklin Parkway or know this building have always seen this facade, which is a freestanding wall which sits in front of the garden entrance into the museum. This is a reproduction of a reproduction. It was originally based on a chateau in France, which subsequently burned, but which Rodin really loved. So he actually had that wall reproduced in his garden, his own private garden at home. So this is the private garden at home. And then when Jacques Rebet and Paul Cray began to work on this new Rodin Museum and thinking about the Franklin Parkway, they reproduced that reproduction. So this is the entrance, freestanding wall, a kind of stage set that is set closest to the Franklin Parkway.
And if you go up to the Parkway, certainly in that distance between City Hall and the PMA, what you see is that it's an active park with layers of activity and a very, very close connection to the neighbors on either side. So in fact, this is an active park. And as we think about President Obama's legacy, I should say, and thinking about where it is and what it means to Jackson Park in Chicago, we're constantly thinking about what is the meaning of all of this. And this is the plan then of the Rodin Museum by Cray at the top and the gate down below. And interestingly, it frames landscape, a defined landscape, another French device, or actually a Renaissance device, or actually a Roman device, maybe even a Chinese device.
You're really
Indeed.
winging it here, okay.
Okay.
So this is the view from the Franklin Parkway, and from the Rodin Museum, then you can see the Barnes Foundation building, which happens to be simply just down the street.
So we're 6 minutes into this, and I can see we're going to start talking about Dr. Barnes. This is Dr. Barnes, who didn't live on the Parkway and grew up poor in Philadelphia. You may know he was a boxer and went to Central High, and was kind of a tough guy, but a person that really believed in education and in lifting himself from his bootstraps, and went to the University of Pennsylvania, and with someone else, actually, as most people live on the shoulders of other people. He captured this business of argyrol, which is used in drops in babies' eyes, I believe, to help prevent blindness.
But he was a great believer in education, and he was also a great believer that it should be democratic. So he was actually very good friends with John Dewey, and he amassed this collection of art originally with the idea that it would be for the education of what he believed was the common person.
Now, actually, Dr. Barnes married a very interesting and powerful woman who was interested in gardens, and they bought a horticultural estate in Marion, Pennsylvania. And so Dr. Barnes placed his collection and their home in the middle of this garden in Marion, and Laura Barnes actually tended to the arboretum, which it surrounded it. So basically, this is a kind of an isolated, idyllic condition, but actually not in the center of Philadelphia.
So this is the original building, which is a neoclassical building designed by Paul Cray. It's one of the sort of first of the sort of American kind of house museums, and had a very special sense that you walked into it that was very, very personal.
Dr. Barnes then, working with his his eyes and his head decided that you actually didn't need to know all the history of paintings. You really needed to understand paintings through line, form, color, and the organization of the canvas, and the organization of canvas to space or place. And so he came up with this idea of an ensemble. That is, the entire wall was an ensemble of images, and you would find your way through the ensemble by the organization of the images. And he worked on this literally throughout his life until he died one evening, returning home to reorganize the paintings one more time. He did it every night, I understand, or nearly every night, and was struck by a truck while he sped through a stop sign.
So
51.
If you look at each wall, if you look at each ensemble, you can see that you can run a line through the center, and that essentially each ensemble is bilaterally symmetrical. So if you see a Rodin on one, not a Rodin.
No, Renoir.
Renoir, the other
got a lot of those.
If you see a Renoir on one side, you'll see the Renoir on the other side. But they have they're hung with a visual relationship to each other. And the same thing is true with the medieval hardware, which he saw as an art unto itself and is also hung. So everything works together, speaks to each other, and it makes for a very, very intense artistic experience, which is akin to being at a ping pong game, because the entire time you're looking here, you're looking there, you're looking here, you're looking there, because you're trying to make that relationship.
But I wanted to say it's interesting that he also ties back to our friend Benjamin Franklin, who was interested in the common arts, that intelligence came from all people. So Dr. Barnes believed that the person that made a piece of hardware was just as much an artist as the painter who then sells the canvas. That was also true about African art. In fact, he was one of the first people to see African art as an art in and of itself and not simply a study in anthropology.
So despite his belief during his lifetime that this was a collection for the people, it became harder and harder to go to the Barnes Foundation because it's in a very affluent suburb. People didn't want buses, tour buses, public transportation to come to Marion. And so it became a sort of very, very reduced population of people who would come to see the collection. As well, there was not that much funding because it wasn't that public of an institution. So
and
the
Dr.
board...
Barnes also stipulated no photographs of the paintings. Mm-hmm. No painting could ever leave the wall and travel. Therefore, he couldn't collect, he couldn't share his work whatsoever at all. And after 1951 until basically 2000, the funding for the Barnes Foundation slowly decreased, and the cost of running the operation increased.
So the board decided to move it to downtown Philadelphia, which was a very controversial decision, and they needed to go to court in order to get a court order to move the collection, because that was part of a stipulation in Barnes's will. What the court did say was that the ensembles need to stay intact and the sequence of the galleries needed to be replicated. So those were the rules that were given to us as architects when we thought about this commission.
Well, the commission came from a whole pool of architects down to, 7 of us who presented our ideas. Some of them created models for the interview. And Billie this is Billie's drawing and her intelligent idea. Maybe I supported it. But that she saw that in Marion, the gallery was in a garden. And in Philadelphia, one of the problems with that gallery in a garden is that none of the windows looked into Laura Barnes' garden. The light was prohibitive, and so curtains had been drawn, and there was no relationship between the interior and the exterior. And that became increasingly difficult because of the conditions of the paintings and the museum conditions that were required. But in moving it to Philadelphia, we wondered whether we couldn't actually not only keep the gallery in a garden, but put the garden back in the gallery. After all, these are largely Impressionist paintings, largely painted in plein air. So we presented this as an idea.
So since this is a plan of the gallery spaces, And
And
as
in Marion.
In Marion, and
Oh.
it's in all neoclassical plans, it's symmetrical. So as we looked at the original plan, knowing that we had to keep the galleries in sequence, we saw that you could essentially take a scissors and cut off the last 2 galleries
3 galleries on each side,
and
on each
split
level.
them away from the
Pull them
main
apart
body.
conceptually and allow the sequence of galleries to remain intact, the sizes to remain intact. So we brought in a small model, solid wood, and then we pulled the model apart and inserted elements that were light-bearing into those as a kind of way of defining the idea. So we did have a prop.
And there's a more diagrammatic plan which shows that what we did was we inserted an interior courtyard and a kind of study room as a space that separated the galleries and gave you a sense of at least a respite from the intensity of looking at the collection.
Well, if we go back, thank you. We realized that the judge was very clear that the paintings needed to remain in their position and with the hardware in every room. That was a requirement. The rooms needed to be maintained in sequence, so we looked for the places where we could break the rules, according to the judge, in order to make our architecture. So that whole idea was, where can we make an exception to the rules? This was the building that was on the Parkway, actually by a very famous architect at the end of his career, William Van Allen, in 1952, created this thing we called euphemistically a youth study center. It was a prison. And anyone who was in Philadelphia 10, 15 years ago remembers this and realized that actually architecturally it's quite handsome, but I would say rather foreboding. And basically the people who were in that park by that building were largely people who were either homeless or and not in perfect condition, maybe. So the site was abandoned. So this is a plan of the barns not so far away in Marion, it's interestingly, but definitely not on the Parkway. And so what we're doing is we're seeing the Barnes collection was given that piece of land, which is the Youth Study Center. Subsequently, it's moved out to 49th and Haverford, and I think seems like at least a more humane facility.
So it really is that constellation of cultural buildings that comes and happens along the Franklin Parkway, starting, of course, with the PMA, and then working its way down to Logan Circle.
Well, indeed, the crash of 29 stopped a lot of building on the Parkway. Virtually nothing was built ever since that time, with the exception of the Youth Study Center. So our building becomes the first building on the Parkway, really since 1934. This is the plan of the building, and actually drawn by the great landscape architect Laurie Olin, but it was, I would say, our idea to put the building in the center of the lot and to try to surround it by park.
So the streetscape, which is a quite civic streetscape, the street is very, very wide and is bounded by a series of London plane trees, we've kept intact. And that sense of walking into a garden, which is what happened when you went to Marion, was very important. So when we designed this building, many people said, well, why didn't you put the front door on the Franklin Parkway? Because that is the sort of more traditional place where one enters a civic building from the Parkway. We said, no, part of the experience is walking into a garden, dropping your shoulders, and that's what happened in Marion, and that's what we wanted to do here.
And this is an early sketch. I mean, I want to say, as people who don't use computers, we're perfectly happy and still do show the President, First Lady, our hand drawings, and ask for critique on that, because it's actually important, as Billie did, a very simple drawing, is that our clients are not architects. They actually want to have simple, clear information rather than be befuddled.
But we actually do use computers in our studio, so that is a real fact of life. This is a slightly more clarified drawing, and essentially the lowest bar is that bar of the plan of the gallery spaces, with the interjection of a garden and a study space. The space in between is what we call a light court, and we'll show you images of it. And the L-shaped building is support building. So that has a cafe, it has changing exhibits gallery, it has offices on the second floor, and those are all the other things that you needed to have when you're running a real museum.
Actually, one of the issues, and those probably didn't notice that we were actually putting large mock-ups on the Parkway, thinking about what this stone should be. If we look at the stone on the Parkway, it's all American stone. Paul Cray used French limestone, so we tried to figure out what's the right stone and wanted to make sure we were doing the right thing. So tested out different stones in a large scale, and we threw drapes over them so people couldn't add their comments. One of the things we do is we like to visit, if you want to get good vegetables, you don't go to Whole Foods. That used to be something we wanted to do. We don't do that anymore. You actually go to the person who grows them. And so we went to the quarries where the stone is cut, and we saw how it was cut. We then saw how it was treated and talked to people who were actually hand working the stone, and we realized that they could do that astonishingly well at reasonable cost. And we asked them what they could do and like to do, and we used a lot of it.
So one of the things I think in our work, which continues to persist even as time sort of asks us to be faster and faster, we're rather slow in our decisions, and we are very, very committed to understanding materials and understanding the potential of materials, which can be, as Todd says, best understood when you go to the people who actually work them.
Dr. Barnes collected African fabrics. We also have some African fabrics. And so we thought about, in this neoclassical building, could we actually do something slightly radical, which is to wrap it in what we conceptualized as a fabric of stone. And so this is a model that we made and many other drawings to try to understand what it meant not to create a solid stone building, but a fabric of stone.
So we're constantly trying to refer back to what was there. So if you think about the neoclassical building that Paul Cray designed, there are these horizontal bands that are sort of ordering bands for neoclassical architecture. And our building also has horizontal bands, but the bands are broken up, and it's thinking about the collection that Dr. Barnes actually had. So we're trying to knit together both a sense of history, connection to the past, and a sense of what it is very particular about what it is that is very particular about this collection.
And how can architecture, which is contemporary, be warm? This is the facade. We used an Israeli stone. We got it from the Negev. There are two different actually portions of the stone type. One more dense, which is on the outside. It's called Ramon Gray from the Negev, which we visited. You can see we used any piece of stone that was of solid stock there. We didn't care about them being even color. And then we wove them together and superimposed them on a very contemporary way of cladding a building, which is a rain screen. So we then balanced warm with cold, which is what Dr. Barnes was doing on the walls of his galleries.
So we think that it both sits on the Franklin Parkway because it is a kind of limestone, but of course it also stands apart and announces that it is a contemporary building.
And there are many important things about this building. It is the first LEED Platinum building. The entire top of that upper roof is solar panels, and about 10% of its power comes from that, green roofs and so on. And we also wanted to make sure that cars didn't drive right up to the building. You had to leave your car and walk through a garden to get into the building. Here's the contemporary facade on the Parkway, which is actually the most boring of the facades, in my opinion. It actually establishes every one of the windows inside where the windows were. So we're playing the rules by the game. No additional windows. This is Laurie Olin's drawing of a fountain. We worked together with Laurie to create a kind of civic fountain that related to what we knew existed in Paris and what would be appropriate for the Parkway.
So Laurie Olin is a landscape architect from Philadelphia. Really, I think the most important landscape architect, one of the most important landscape architects in America. And here's the fountain that he thought about. It's a civic gesture, so it runs along the Franklin Parkway and is of a civic scale. It's quite monumental.
And his drawings of the trees, thinking about trees, he actually is an architect, but he also really knows his trees and draws so beautifully. These are on the right side of Deodora pines you pass between when you walk up to the building. So the building is seen within a screen of trees.
But those drawings were thinking about what are the right trees to have on that pathway. So he's really drawing that particular pathway.
Yeah, these are the red Japanese maples under which you walk, and then in the wintertime a stone garden, in the summertime a reflecting pool to help to delay the idea of getting into this building, to delay the sense of actually being in a very urban condition, much like, in a way, Paul Kray wanted to do with the Rodin Museum. Here we're looking at the Free Library and a sculpture by Ellsworth Kelly that came after we finished. We then walk into the body of the building. The building doesn't reach out to us like a gas station. You actually enter the building like you're entering the body of something. And then you are within the building and turn right and left, and it's delaying the entrance as much as we can.
There are a lot of details in the building that, like the pattern of the stone, refer back to parts of Dr. Barnes's collection. This is a traditional pattern called a liar's cloth, and this was used as the basis for a stone mosaic floor as you enter into the light court. And indeed, in the Barnes collection in Marion, there are quite a few mosaics that were done as using African motifs.
Actually, that's your drawing on the left, after the liar's cloth, from which the mosaic was made. So it is, in fact,
iterative. Yeah.
Big word.
Big word.
Jesus, okay.
I saved that.
We had the idea that in the barns, you wanted to move up and down through a sort of domestic space. That meant we wanted the stairs to be wood so it felt domestic, the scales to feel domestic, and we thought that the idea of a chandelier would help to instill that idea of a domestic condition. So it kind of creates a little bit of glamour, a sort of come hither idea to take you down to the lower level.
There's so this is in that L-shaped bar, those things that which help an institution welcome people. So there is a restaurant that looks out to a courtyard that is walled. And then this is the light court. So this is that space in between the actual bar of the collection and the L-shaped bar. And it has a kind of a folded plane on the roof, which allows natural light to come in and shift. So it was very important for us. This is the idea of the garden inside the gallery, so that you would go inside and have a sense of serenity and connection to nature.
What we wanted, the carpet of wood is actually reclaimed wood from the Coney Island Boardwalk substructure. So we tried to bring warmth in and to create, once again, a sense of domesticity. We designed the couches using a Senegalese fabric to help to draw history from different places in order to warm things up. The idea of the light box, which has its PV panels on the top, was to not bring light in directly, but to bounce it in to help to create a mystery of the source of light. And that light box is there illuminated at night, but bringing in light during the day, reinforced by artificial light.
We worked with a Dutch fabric artist who wove these panels out of silk and wool felt, and in many ways asked her to reproduce the sense of sunlight moving across the stone face. So the upper level, which is etched glass, has offices behind it, and that glass is set on top of stone, which is worked, and then below it are the panels of silk and felt, which are also there to help with acoustic absorption.
And the spaces, fortunately now, with the refreshed barns, lots of things can happen in that space. That's unprogrammed space which can evolve over the years, and that's really, we think, a significant value both to the barns and to the city of Philadelphia. These are changing exhibits galleries where we are trying to show, as we do from time to time, the actual concrete structure of the building, but give us glimpses of the world outside.
And a relatively recent show by the artist Yinka Shonibari.
That light box cantilevers out toward the Rodin Museum, creating a kind of space, as Rodin did with the gate, to help to frame the landscape and to frame outside versus inside. We went to the barns, and that's Derek Gilman there, who lifted up the drape one day in one of the galleries and said, look how the paintings change when you give it natural light. And so we then dedicated ourselves to trying to bring natural light into all the galleries.
So we were lucky enough to be able to have a gallery constructed off-site that was the same size as one of the galleries, and experimented with how light came in. So you see there experiments with a kind of new skylight, which doesn't let in direct light but lets in a glow. And we also looked at all of the detailing, because we are essentially modernist architects, and our vocabulary has never included moldings.
Wood moldings and traditional moldings. We then went to lectures, got in some experts, and then we decided the only way we could learn was actually to recreate the original moldings so we understood how it was put together, and then slowly evolve a variant on that. And so what we have here on this image is the original gallery on the right, and its other half on the left. The docents who had been there forever before, who were really afraid of moving, said, they came in and said, the galleries are just like they were before. The wood windows are there. There were never wood windows in those galleries. They were always painted. But they were sufficiently comforted by this sort of sense of continuity that I think that they couldn't see the change.
So this is the main gallery, and there's the, as it was in Marion, and then on the far side, as it is in Philadelphia. So what we were trying to do was try to understand the character of the collection and of the place, and then in many ways try to simplify it and intensify it. So we thought very hard about every single detail and tried to capture the essence of the place. In many ways, it created a memory for something that never really existed.
For example, the frieze on the existing gallery was actually was a frieze made by, I thought, inspired by African motifs. Masks, and on the left we created another one that is close to but different from that. But what we've done is we've hidden lights in that, so that in fact we light the galleries completely differently than had ever been done before. So the lighting changed. We went back to an original burlap and then colored the back of the burlap. We created wood windows where there were not and used different glass.
So at the entrance to the gallery, this is Todd's sketch of a gate, and it's a gate that closes when the galleries are closed and is backed by glass, and is also based on some African money.
And the galleries today, I mean, actually much of the time the shades are down. There are 2 levels of shades, and in fact the curators don't really let the sun in, but the light levels are such that they could be open at virtually all times of the day. Certainly they're open, and you look into the garden adjacent when they are open. These are the spaces in between, a place for reflection and reading, sitting down. A stair, once again, a wooden stair that takes us up to the upper level. Galleries of which they're all naturally lighted from above, quite different from in Marion.
So this is a painting which is in many ways one of the masterpieces of the collection. It's Matisse, and it's the Joie de Vivre. And in the past, it had hung in a stairway, which was actually the only painting we were allowed to move because it was not accessible to people unless they could walk up and down the stairway. And so we were able to create a small gallery where you can actually get close to it, because before you were always looking up at it from the landing, which was halfway up the stairs.
So everyone knows that the Joie de Vivre, I think, is 1907, early part of the career, and 20 years later he produces the dance. So we can see the arc of this same figure in the barns. One of the upper level galleries with both the natural light and the ability to look outside.
This is an upper level that looks down into that interior courtyard, which was one of the ideas of bringing the garden inside.
Well, and then that stairway with the chandelier that helps to encourage you to go to the lower level, which we call a garden level, but which is a basement. Let's be clear. But in the basement, a lot of things happen. For example, the shop's in the basement. Dr. Barnes kept his pots in the basement. We have an auditorium, classrooms, the library, and so on. So in fact, it does enliven the lower level, which...
There's a place where one can look at the catalogs and read them. And then it has become a much more informal place, so that there's a coffee bar and these comfortable chairs which are surrounding that light court, which drives all the way through the interior of the building. It has a library on the back side of it, and brings light to the lower level, as Todd says.
And there we have an auditorium, which is an accessible and very pleasant auditorium that would be about the size of this one. Very, very good for voice, not great for music because it doesn't have the height. And then we have the ability to conserve all of the artwork on site up in the building. So other things that we cared a great deal about is make sure that, as Dr. Barnes believed in his workers having a good life, that the offices were as good as the spaces down below. And we're really close to our final images here.
This is a close-up of the light box looking into the conservation area.
Well, what you can see is that the light box itself is largely a falsehood. It's just a screen of glass, inside of which is another layer of glass. So a very little bit of light can deliver a huge amount of effect. And,
this is the last image.
and Billie insisted on this image. It's supposed to be either you at the audience.
No, I think that the Barnes in its new life is trying to understand how it can connect to contemporary art. So there is both this incredible Impressionist collection, but there's also the possibility for things like performances. So this is either one very tired visitor, but I actually think it's a performance piece that was done in one of the galleries. So thank you very much.
That was great, thank you. And we have some time for questions. And I'll just say you're so right about the intensity of the experience of being there because there's no labels.
Yeah.
And so, you know, whatever you know about art history, you have to project onto it. But since you're not going to know everything, you're confronted with the visual experience without the kind of intellectual screen of knowing the history of who the artist is. It's very fascinating museum experience. But anyway, questions? Yes.
Hi, Howard Gardner from Cambridge, Mass. And that's actually relevant because I'm probably not the only person here who was thinking about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which, like Barnes, was supposed to be for the ages. I'm interested, under what conditions do you think that museums or libraries should be left just the way they are, as opposed to when it's perfectly okay to reinvent it as you did? Are there any untouchables from your perspective?
I guess we'd have to say that there are no untouchables, but we work for people, and we have to believe in the people and the mission for whom we're working in order to feel comfortable in entering into that challenging territory. And I can say that we're always some distance between us, our beliefs and desires, and our clients. So there is a natural tendency there. But I would have said, I would say there are no untouchables. What about you?
That's such a dangerous thing to say.
I said it.
I know.
Did you say it? Would you agree? I'm there. Hey, I'm there. What about you?
Well, I think what we try to do in our work is to think about whether our values align with the values of an institution. So if I felt that our values didn't align, I don't think we would do the work. So when the Barnes Foundation came to us, there was a huge amount of criticism saying that we were selling out to sort of big, I don't know, we're selling out. And we studied the writing of Albert Barnes and what he felt about education and what he felt his collection meant and what it was supposed to mean to people. And we believed from reading about him, and actually Neil Rudenstein, who is
from Cambridge, and he wrote an important paper, and frankly, to me, Neil was more important than Dr. Barnes' writing in assessing the issue. So I don't think we alone could do it. I think we actually have to rely on our clients, somewhat, of course, on ourselves and the two of us, but we also need to rely on people we respect who are really much deeper into the subject.
Up in the balcony.
My name is David Maxey from Philadelphia. I think you've answered the question that I was going to put to you, and that is, who is your client? Who was your client for the Barnes Commission? Was it Dr. Barnes in absentia, or how did you, in the process of consultation, find that decisions could be made?
It's always an interesting question. Why don't you take this one on?
I mean, that's why we're partners. I think that obviously there's a board, and we were answering to the board. I think the board was concerned with actually the longevity of the collection, because they were no longer able to sort of support the collection and the sort of mechanically, in terms of taking care of it, in terms of the heating and the ventilation and the air conditioning needs that such a collection requires, as well as they felt that their mission was not in connection with Dr. Barnes's vision. So we answered to the board. We answered to two people in particular who were members of the board. I think we were also very, very much aware of what Dr. Barnes's wishes were. He clearly was not one of the easiest men when we read about how he treated visitors, but he did have a very clear opinion that the collection was for a sort of more democratic group of people.
Yeah, that's totally right. I would say you definitely couldn't trust us channeling Dr. Barnes. I mean, that was a big mistake that happened in the Frank Lloyd Wright. After Frank Lloyd Wright died, for years, people were still addressing any work that would be done out of the Wright Foundation as, what would Mr. Wright have done? And it produced a lot of crap. Sorry.
Is that the first time crap was used up on this stage?
It did. It was just garbage. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Bill Madeira, and I have a bifurcated question. Was this the first time you had ever done anything like the light box? Because it feels almost like a zeppelin floating above it. In other words, is there another piece of your work that uses a similar?
Well, that's interesting. No, the light box as an object, and it is an object, and we were very afraid of producing an object on the Parkway, but actually,
There are a lot of objects on the Parkway.
No, but this is a luminous object on the Parkway. That was potentially, fortunately, it's a low-lying piece. It's interesting that our President Obama said he liked that. I've always felt it's pretty aggressive, but we've often dealt with the issue of borrowed light in our work. And indeed, he said he liked it, and so we had, hey, maybe that's the right thing to do. But no, it isn't the right thing to do. You have to determine when it's the right thing to do. And I don't know whether we'll do it again. It was it came from a collaboration in the studio.
Well, I also think when, people always ask architects, what is your favorite building? And so our favorite building is the Pantheon. And it very much that we continue to be really always inspired by this idea of how natural light does things to spaces and makes you feel alive. So one way or another, I think the idea of how the light comes in is something that continues in our work. The actual form of that has just happened that one time.
And how closely did you work with Laurie Olin?
Very
when
closely.
You go there, it seems so seamless.
Seamless, yeah.
Very closely.
Well, we remember our first meeting was in Rome over wine, but I think we took the basic architectural design quite a distance before Laurie really came on. We sort of had to solve the building problem, which is the most difficult thing, and then Laurie came on, and it was very, very seamless. We did see eye to eye, and he was a wonderful person with whom to work. And he still we send each other love letters. Yeah, he's a wonderful human being and was a great collaborator.
Hi, I'm Ruth Schwartz, Count from New York. I have a two-part question. I think the first part will be easy to answer. Is there anything of the old building left?
You mean the existing building? It still exists. Is that?
It
The
is
prison
act-
building is incorporated into the...
No, the old building exists in Marion as a building without
No,
art.
that's not the building I meant. I meant the prison building that was on
Oh,
the side.
no, there isn't. In fact, actually, one way of getting, of being very careful to recycle all of that material, which was done very, very carefully so that we made sure we recycled. There's a sculpture, and I've forgotten the name of the sculpture that was at the base of the building. And
Wait.
someone here would know, and I don't know where that
I
is.
think we need to ask the
The
question
Youth
again.
Study Center. Am I right?
Yes.
That doesn't exist at all. And we thought about it, but it literally is in the exact site of the building. And sometimes we leave those things. We had our building torn down in New York, and there's nothing left there either. I think nothing left is just fine.
There's a second part to my question, was that you were very clear that the Barnes collection was in financial straits at the time the decision was made to move it to Philadelphia. Well, the building you built must have been very expensive.
It was.
So how was it paid for?
It was paid for largely by the land was given for $1, as I recall, by the city. The city planned to move the Youth Study Center, which is now, I think, the Youth Center for Freedom and Justice, and is a much larger facility, I should say, and I don't want to go deeper into that. It was paid largely by 3 institutions that they were trying to get money from but couldn't get money from because it was not really a public institution. And the moment it was said to come to the Barnes, the 3 institutions came forward, the Lenfest,
Annenberg.
Annenberg, and the Pew.
Yeah.
They then gave the body of the money to the building that allowed the physical building to be built with the fees and so on. And then they fundraised for their endowment, which they continue to do.
I'm James Hill. I'm from Philadelphia. It's a superb building and a real gift to the city. Recent exhibition at the Barnes of Barnes's correspondence with Paul Philippe Cray on the building of the 1920s building in Marion makes it clear that Barnes didn't like skylights. And he talks about PAFA, where he had his disastrous exhibition of his collection first, and he's very anti-skylight. Mm-hmm. I happen to think the light box is a wonderful idea, but did any of the trustees talk to you about this correspondence?
We were aware of it, and we didn't think about them actually for the first year or two, and then Derek began to show us natural light, and we went to the National Gallery in London by chance and began to sort of get our heads around the idea of, in London we also visited by Rick Mather. Great. She fails me. Okay. Several other buildings that had beautiful clerestory light, historic buildings that illuminated the galleries perfectly. And it gave us the confidence to say, let's make a full-scale mock-up and test this out very carefully and slowly. And we worked with the same lighting designer, Paul Morantz, who did the National Gallery. And he and we worked very, very closely to get this right. We knew that it was not what Barnes wanted, but I should say Barnes was kind of a cheapskate. And if you look at the detailing in there, that building was very poorly detailed. He was basically picking up moldings off some sort of a cut-rate hardware store. It wasn't the same quality detailing that you see next door in the Rodin Museum. Sorry.
Yes, Rissa Bonfante, New York. I used to take busloads of students to the Old Barnes Foundation, and I haven't seen the new one yet, but I was intrigued. Can you hear? Okay.
That's okay. Right up to your face.
Okay, all right. I was intrigued and moved to see how similar the rooms are and the colors. And of course, this is something that I think all museums face when and how to change, so I'm fine with that. I have a question for you, but first, if I may just tell a little anecdote about how difficult Barnes was. because he had been mistreated by art critics who had criticized, saying that the paintings were worked over, which they may have been. And so he would not let any intellectuals or art critics in. And so Erwin Panofsky, the art historian, wanted to go, and he couldn't go. An art historian who was the son of a railroad engineer managed to get in. So Panofsky had a wonderful idea, and I'm telling the story wrong, but actually one day Einstein called up, or Einstein's secretary called up and said, "May I come and visit the collection?" And of course Barnes said, "Of course, you know, we'd be very happy to have you." So Barnes came, Einstein came with a chauffeur-driven limousine, which if you knew Einstein, you knew was a strange kind of situation. And so Einstein said, "Do you mind if my chauffeur comes too?" And of course, he was a worker, so that was fine. So the chauffeur took his hat off and held it to his chest and went through, followed Einstein and Barnes, and of course it was Panofsky, you know. So that's how he got to see the collection. But I do have a question. What happened to the Matisse's painting that was at the top of the stairs?
That was, of course,
So that was the Joie de Vivre, and it was it was the one painting. We showed an image of a small gallery, and it was one hanging on one wall, and all the other paintings essentially stayed in the ensembles, but the Matisse painting in the stairway got its own little gallery, so you could stand on the floor and look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
that should be it.
Thanks.
All right? Oh, there's one more.
Go. That's it.
Thank you.
Okay.